Okay, our next speaker. Barbara Pralle from Johns Hopkins University. She is the head of the Entrepreneurial Library Program, the Sheridan Libraries at Johns Hopkins, where she oversees development and management of financially sustainable services. She's also the interim manager for the JHU Data Management Services Group.
Great, thanks, Matt. Hi, as Matt shared, I'm heading up the JHU Data Management Services team at Hopkins right now, and part of my talk is going to focus in on it as a particular one of the services we're providing. But as I was thinking about this panel, sort of stepping back and thinking broadly as a university what we're doing, so I want to share with you a little bit of context first there and some background. I kind of think of it as we're looking at finding our way into the data curation waters. We're really a two-pronged strategy at Hopkins. One is that my colleagues in the Digital Research and Curation Center, who also head up the Data Conservancy Project, have been doing what I call deep dives. They've been working on use cases in particular situations with researchers and collections, similar to the pilots that David's talking about, digging deep into the data, understanding how it needs to be organized, it's used. So they've been learning how to work with data across a variety of domains, but again, in this deep way. In the JHU DMS, we're doing something quite different. We're rippling across. In other words, we're providing data management planning support. That means we're working with a wide variety of researchers across a much wider range of domains on our campus, and we're gaining an understanding of these different domains in their research data. These two strategies come together, I think, in a way that helps us understand how to begin to build services across all the needs. This guide here I put together, I call it the Data Curation Continuum. It's really inspired by a diagram that Carol Palmer put together and shared with us from the University of Illinois in a data curation workshop last summer, where she really defines the different kinds of data, research data, resource data, and reference data. And I flipped it because I like to think about it from the researcher perspective. We've got individual researchers starting to work in fields across many different domains, many of them emerging. Maybe there are some standards, often more than not, there aren't any. Just as you heard earlier this morning, I think the survey of only 40%, I think, the speaker shared, had standards in their domain. They're often not thinking about data management planning whatsoever unless they're required to, say by the NSF. But as they work in their fields, they're really beginning to amass data and want to start sharing it, and they start to understand sort of the value of aggregation, kind of going into these emerging research clusters. And as all this matures, we get to a point where you've got the need for a third party to manage a repository or archive with real standards, the ability to develop tools, and so forth. So we have this whole continuum, and we have to figure out how to serve our communities at all stages of this continuum. And that's really what our strategy is doing, is thinking about all aspects of that. So how did we get here at Hopkins? A little bit of background. We started, there's a series of efforts over many years that I think got us to a place where we had a good foundation to get started. We did digitization projects. We launched a series of different groups over the years. I'd say in 2005 we started to really take a close look at the Sloan Digital Sky Survey data to understand data curation there and the issues around working with that kind of a large data set. We started reviewing repository and infrastructure needs and platforms. In 2008, we sort of began one of our first collaborative efforts between my team, which is the Entrepreneurial Library Program, and the Digital Research and Curation Center at Hopkins. We worked together to establish two data archiving partnerships with external organizations, really creating real agreements around real scope services and what we would deliver. In the subsequent years, we started work on the Data Conservancy and in particular use cases, which I described earlier, these deep dives into data. In 2010, the sustainability team on that grant started to pilot and think about data management services and support. And then we launched the JHU Data Management Services Group in 2011. So I want to talk a little bit about how did this work, what's allowed us to very rapidly, and I'll go through how we launched these, rapidly launched the services. So our two groups, there's two kind of characteristics that came together, I think, were somewhat unusual at Hopkins in that we have these two different groups. groups. One is this Digital Research and Curation Center that's really an R&D arm. They really focus on research and development, and that's their strength. At the same time, they understand how to move things into really more of a production environment, so they have an appreciation for that. In the ELP, one of the things that we do is we launch and successfully operationalize services very quickly. We really focus on customer service and think about how to continue to build new services and innovate, so we have a real appreciation for that. So our two cultures were quite compatible and appreciative of one another and allowed us to collaborate and launch this new set of services. It really helped too that we're co-located, so there was a lot of organic communication and collaboration across our teams that really let all this perk up. In fact, we do have one individual in our JHU DMS team that's part of both the DRCC and the JHU DMS. So let me talk a little bit about what are these services. You're probably wondering, what's the scope? There's really two sets of services. One is we provide data management planning consultative services as PIs are preparing proposals. The other is a data archiving service, and I'll get to that in a minute. The consultative services are somewhat similar to a reference interview. We go out on site, meet with researchers, talk about their research, investigate, and really explore their different data products, try to understand their research, look at what they're doing operationally with their data, as well as what they might need to do in terms of data management in an archival sense. One of the things we use to help that process is a questionnaire we've been iterating over 18 months now. With every interaction we've had with a researcher, we've gone back and looked at how do we make this process very efficient, very streamlined, and focused on that researcher. I think one of our earlier speakers in the morning talked about only 1 hour of time with a researcher. We've learned their time is incredibly tight, and we need to really be responsive to that, respect their time to gain their respect and understanding of what we can do. So by working with them in a fashion that lets them develop a plan quickly, and a competitive plan is of great value to them and to the whole process. I think of it as baby steps. We have to meet them where they're at, with the needs they have at that point in time. And so one of the things we do is explore with them what kind of options they have for data management. In some domains have very established repositories. So we'll go look at those with them, help them understand that choice and the implications of that choice. We also have the JHU Data Archive, which again I'll get to in a minute, but that's an option, and we share with them what that option entails. We don't steer them to one particular choice. We help them understand these choices and then support them in the writing of their plan and how that's going to be articulated. So the process continues often, not just on site meeting with them, but we iterate by email. Let me talk a little bit about the archiving services. We have at Hopkins established the JHU Data Archive. It uses the software systems developed and continuing to be developed by the Data Conservancy Project. So it's an archive that was launched in October and functionality continues to be built around it. But the service is much more than simply archiving. We go into in-depth planning with the researcher, thinking about all aspects of planning for transfer, thinking about how is this data going to be organized, what kind of standards are we going to recommend, especially when there might not be standards for that researcher. Then we help them with the transfer process and help them understand how to use the archive and how they're going to get information back out and be able to use it. The archive will conducts integrity checks, and in the future we'll have format migrations as needed. And we're working on tools that we're going to layer on top of this archive, and it's so that the researcher continues to be able to use the data perhaps in new ways as more and more data is brought into the archive. So one of the things we do is very carefully scope what we are or aren't going to do. So let me talk about what we don't provide, because I think that's important. We don't say that we're going to take unlimited amounts of data, and we don't agree to archive data for unlimited amounts of time, and we're very clear about that. We have caps. We don't provide operational data management solutions. Rather, we collaborate with our colleagues in central IT, and together share the solutions they have to offer and steer our researchers there. We're really focused on the archival piece. We don't provide in-depth curation through this service. really, again, this is coming back to that continuum I talked about, trying to meet the researcher where they're at this point in their research and what makes sense at this stage. We don't write the plans. We're very clear about that. This is the researcher's plan in agreement with NSF. They need to own that language. What we do is we really work with them, though, to make sure there are no gaps, there's great clarity, and that they covered all the points that they really need to cover, particularly in their domain as it relates to their community and their community practices. Finally, we don't provide any kind of boilerplate language broadly for plans. We don't believe that's a good plan is built on boilerplate language. Rather, a good plan is tailored to that individual researcher and their work. And finally, we don't currently manage encumbered data in our archive. It's really designed to be open for data sharing, but we will have the ability to embargo for those situations where someone is certainly thinking about publication. If we don't provide that capability, I think we're going to miss opportunities to bring that data in and work with those researchers. So I apologize, this is a little bit difficult to read, and I'm not going to go into every aspect of this, but one of the things that we really thought about as we were planning for development and launch of the service was building it upon the three facets of sustainability: financial sustainability, human sustainability, and technical sustainability. These really were the pillars that drove what we did. So I'm going to touch on a few points in here to give you the taste of the kinds of things we focused on as we went to develop the service. On the financial sustainability front, we took a very close and hard look at what would the investment be that would be needed to run this service and both sets of services. We looked at the human component. In other words, how many people, how many hours to do consultative work, how many hours to do in-depth work involved in bringing things into the archive. How many proposals does Hopkins seek every year? How many awards do we get? We poured into all this data and took a careful look at it and made some assumptions of what we thought was needed over the next 5 years. Then we flipped it and started looking sort of at the hardware needs. What kind of systems would we need in place? How much data might we be managing? And again, look to projecting cost. Put in overhead, put in all the other kinds of costs that you really have to pay attention to. And we prepared a 5-year budget and brought that to the deans at Hopkins. Now you may wonder, why were we bringing this to the deans? So a little background on our environment. We too are a very decentralized environment, but much more broadly, I'd say, in the financial sense. Our library is not centrally funded. Rather, the schools we support our library and pay into the budget. So every time we want to launch a new service, we actually have to go out and secure the commitment and funding from the different schools that we would support. So we put this budget and a proposed scope of services in front of the deans, and we're talking about over a couple of weeks. They responded very quickly, were enthusiastic, and then worked with us on a financial model. So, okay, we have to figure out how we're going to pay for this. So we split the two services apart, and the deans from those schools that actively seek NSF funding said, we will help direct fund this consultative service. We want our PIs to be as competitive as they can be. So we'll give you that money, and we created an allocation model between the schools according to the usage. Then on the archiving services, we created a very different model. We said we'd charge a fee back on the grants, and that fee would be designed to be cross-recovery and managed through the service center. So again, we had to really think carefully about our costs and what we expected would happen in order to secure and set up some financial structures and models. So let me move on to human sustainability. So we started thinking about what we would need in terms of people expertise. We went back to some of those use cases and deep dives that our colleagues took in the Data Curation Center, and took a look at what skills and strengths were needed for these kinds of positions of work. Then we recruited people with those backgrounds, and there began a lot of cross-training between the two groups so that information could flow. We have a strong buddy system. We go out together and meet with researchers. We all have different strengths and knowledge that we bring to that situation, and we learn from one another. And we have an active system. After every time we meet with a researcher, we debrief and we learn from that process and use that to inform the next conversation. So we've also been building some internal knowledge systems and ways that we track our different researchers and the conversations we've had, so that we won't have to keep reinventing that wheel. We'll just be building upon the knowledge we've started to create. So on the technical sustainability side, we've had to think about systems. Not, for those of you maybe like me, I didn't start out as someone who knew anything about systems, and you'd be like, oh boy. But there's a lot to learn, and there's a lot to consider. And in particular, the software that we are working with has some particular needs. So over a series of, actually over almost 2 years, we worked with a couple of our business school capstone teams to explore different facets of what we needed to understand about systems. We looked at total cost of ownership, disaster recovery, all in relation to what we were developing. And the last capstone we worked with helped us really define the requirements that we're going to need to manage our software. And we put out an RFI in January, and we're pouring through responses right now. It's not an easy task because there are different solutions out there that really can provide very different situations for your software. It depends on your needs, particularly with your data. And so we're in the process of trying to sort through that and be able to kind of move forward this summer with putting in place new systems. So we didn't try to do all of this overnight. It's been a phased launch of services. January through June of last year, we piloted the different kinds of interactions for data management planning. July, we launched the proposal consulting services. By October, we established our first instance of the data conservancy software in the form of the JHU Data Archive. And we're continuing to see incremental expansion of our services. So some examples of that are, we were very strictly on scope to NSF when we first launched, but we're seeing requirements come out through different agencies, and we're already starting to help PIs who come to us with other DMP requirements from other funders. We also have other schools in our university that didn't support the service who are starting to realize, oh, we need help with this too. So we see expansion there. As we go out and meet with PIs, we also find that often they have been amassing data sets that aren't necessarily tied to a grant. And then through the conversations we've had with them, they come to the realization of, oh, I have this set. I've been amassing it over my life's work. What am I going to do with this? It needs a home. And so we're starting to have these conversations, and we see the opportunity to grow the archive to accommodate and address different kinds of data and their data sets. When it's not funded through the model we have right now, we'll have to come up with a new model. And finally, we see also interest in what we're doing, and there may be an opportunity to provide service to other organizations who strategically choose not to set up this kind of operation for themselves. So it's an exciting kind of time. There's a lot to learn. I think we're looking at it as lots of baby steps. I think I heard earlier points about shifting the culture and thinking, and I think that's what we're seeing every day. We just have to, again, meet that PI where they're at and understand what we can introduce at that stage and how we can begin to build their understanding of the value of data management and data curation services. So just want to thank you and see if there might be one or two questions.